that we need to take seriously, and that's what we're doing. Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Can't vote in the interests of Canada while their family members are threatened as consequence of those votes. It is unacceptable, as the Prime Minister said, which is why it's so strange that he accepted it.
Right.
His government produced a briefing note which exposed these threats to the MP's family 2 years ago. And yet the diplomat that worked to punish a Canadian MP's family is still in Canada when the Prime Minister could have expelled him. Why didn't he expel this diplomat?
Yeah! Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It is absolutely unacceptable for any Canadian to be subject to intimidation via foreign power, particularly threats against family and against families of members of Parliament. That's why, as the reports came out this morning, I immediately asked officials to follow up on these reports and to get to the bottom of this. I also asked for outreach both on the political and the official side to the member in question. We are going to continue to make sure this is taken extremely seriously.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, that's just false. He didn't immediately take action. He took action after the media found out about it.
That's right.
His government has known that a Canadian MP had his family threatened because that MP voted for human rights in the House of Commons. He knew about that for 2 years. He did exactly nothing. Furthermore, the same diplomat that orchestrated these threats against the MP's family still works in the Toronto consulate at Beijing, even though the Prime Minister has the power to expel him. Will he expel him today?
Yeah. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
As the reports were made public this morning, we followed up immediately with top officials to get all the information on this file, on what happened, on who was informed and who was not informed, to make sure that we are following up in an appropriate way. This is absolutely unacceptable, and it shouldn't have happened.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
And yet he did accept it for 2 years. The same briefing note indicated 2 years ago that Beijing saw Canada as uniquely vulnerable to its interference because we have no foreign interference laws to stop them. The same laws that exist in the United States and Australia to force those paid by foreign dictatorships to register are not in existence here in Canada. Now, the CSIS warned him about this in the summer of 2021. On what date will we get a foreign influence registry to protect Canadians against these abuses?
Yeah. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
As the government, we've put in place many mechanisms to ensure that Canadians and our institutions are protected from foreign interference, and we are continuing to step up to add more. We brought in NSICOP, it's an oversight committee of parliamentarians. We brought in NSIRA. We created an elections integrity committee composed of top civil servants, and we are right now looking to establish a foreign agent registry, making sure through consultations with potentially impacted communities that it's done the right way. That's what we will continue to do to keep Canadians safe.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
More administrative and bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo to conceal his inaction. It is now required that you register if you lobby for the food bank, but it is not required to register if you do paid work on behalf of a foreign dictatorship to influence Canadian politics. But let's move over to police stations. His public safety minister claimed that all Beijing's police stations have been closed. Today, 2 of those police stations reportedly said, no, they're open, they're operating right here in Canada. Why is the Prime Minister allowing a foreign dictatorship to run police stations on our soil?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You know, the RCMP is taking action against these foreign police stations. This is something we need to see, and I've tasked the minister to make sure that it gets done.
Mr. Speaker. According to Pascal Fournier, the former CEO of the Trudeau Foundation, her predecessor, Mr. Rosenberg, is mixed up in the notorious 140,000 Chinese donation. He discussed directly with the donors through a Chinese regime organization and even issued a receipt to an address in China, and then he claimed publicly that this was a donation from a Canadian company. This is the man tasked by the Prime Minister to inquire into foreign interference, but he was involved, mixed up in it up to his neck. In the end, the Liberal inquiry into foreign interference is just smoke and mirrors. Is that right?
Canadians deserve transparency, and this government has refused to call a fully public inquiry every step of the way. Why does the government fail to bring forward the one thing that will restore trust in our democracy?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, from the broad range of experts who've looked into this, there are multiple opinions on whether an open public inquiry is actually the best tool to restore confidence in Canadians. That's why we tasked an independent expert and our former Governor General David Johnston to look at all the tools we have to counter foreign interference, to look at the concerns that Canadians have, and to choose the best path forward. If he chooses a public inquiry, we will absolutely move forward with a public inquiry. We will take the right tools necessary to restore Canadians' confidence.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has to answer these questions. He's known now for 2 years that the family of a Member of Parliament was threatened for harassment and other penalties because of how he voted on human rights in the House of Commons. For 2 years, the Prime Minister did nothing to protect the family or to punish the Canadian-based Beijing diplomat who orchestrated the entire attack against that family. Can the Prime Minister confirm if the responsible diplomat from Beijing will be expelled by the end of business day today?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Speaker, I want to assure every member in this chamber that we take
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I assure every member in this chamber that we take the reports that have surfaced recently very seriously. In fact, I reached out directly to the member for Wellington Halton Hills to share my concerns. I told him that I have instructed CISA to provide him with an update, but this government will continue to take concrete actions to combat foreign interference, including the $49 million that we have allocated in Budget 2023 to protect all Canadians from foreign interference. Mr. Speaker, this is not a partisan issue. We should do this work together to protect all parliamentarians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's time for the Prime Minister to stand up and do his job. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up for what?
I just want to remind the Honourable Order. I want to remind the Honourable members to speak through the Speaker and not directly to each other. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Will the Prime Minister finally stand up for this country and its people against a foreign dictatorship that has been interfering in our land for far too long? Yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, over the heckles of the Conservatives on the other side of the aisle, this Prime Minister and our government has been standing up doing the relentless, tireless work of defense.
Okay. Order. This is not a good start to a Monday, and it started off fairly well. I just want to... Okay, wait a minute. When you start heckling the Speaker, there's a problem there. So, are we going to play nice, or do we start getting tough? I'll let the Honourable Minister for Public Safety start again, and I want to remind the Honourable members how we're going to scramble things or maybe eliminate a few questions as well. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government has been doing the concrete, tireless work that is necessary to combat foreign interference, to protect our democratic institutions by creating new powers, adding more resources for all of the security and intelligence agencies that are there to protect our communities, our institutions, and most importantly, Canadians, Mr. Speaker. I encourage the Conservative politicians on the other side of the aisle to get behind what is a nonpartisan cause and protect Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, at least I got a direct answer. I asked if he would stand up, and of course he did not stand up, which is very clear. This Prime Minister knew for 2 years that Beijing thought Canada was uniquely vulnerable to its bullying and interference because we do not have anti-foreign interference laws, unlike the Australians and Americans. And yet, for 2 years after his intelligence bodies warned him of that, he did absolutely nothing. Will he stand up and do his job now?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, at a pretty young age, I personally learned what it was like to be targeted by an authoritarian communist regime. As a Ukrainian Canadian, I have always known that authoritarian communist regimes particularly target diaspora communities here in Canada. That is wrong, Mr. Speaker. And you know what makes it easier to target Canada and Canadian democracy? When we are divided, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has to stop hiding behind his ministers. The vacation is over. He has work to do. He wants to talk about taking partisanship out of it. You know what would have been a nonpartisan thing to do? To recognize that a Conservative MP, or that any MP for any party, had his family threatened because of a vote casted on this floor, and to take immediate action against the diplomats that did those threats. That would have been the nonpartisan thing to do. Why didn't he do it?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment, and it's uncharacteristic of me to express my outrage at what has happened to the member for Wellington-Halton Hills, and it could be any one of us in this House who is targeted for actions that we have taken. It is an outrage, and we should all express that collectively. This Prime Minister will continue to work for Canadians, for Canadian democracy. We will continue to stand together and make sure that any foreign interference will never be tolerated. If a diplomat has broken the Vienna Convention, he or she will be expelled. You have
the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is running out of ministers to hide behind. While he sits there and smirks, we have a country that is under foreign influence by a dictatorship that has actually opened police stations in this country. Now, according to a report just out today, there are 2 police stations run by Beijing operating in Montreal as we speak. Will the Prime Minister stand up now and tell us how he will close down these police stations?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I assure the Conservative Leader and all members in this chamber that the RCMP have taken concrete action to disrupt and shut down police stations, and if more open up, they will remain vigilant and do the work. And Mr. Speaker, they will do that underpinned by the investments which are earmarked in Budget 2023, which, again, the Conservatives have said, without even reading the document, that they will oppose. So if they're really interested in protecting Canadians from foreign interference, and that's something we should all be united behind, then they should support Budget 2023.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know why the Prime Minister is so afraid to stand up. Maybe it's because he's ashamed that he did absolutely nothing for 2 years after knowing that a Canadian MP was threatened by a foreign dictatorship. He didn't even send the offending diplomat home, and now he's been exposed for it. Then he puts up a whole myriad of ministers to hide behind, one of whom claimed before that the Chinese police stations were closed, and we learned now that they are open. Wow. Given that we can't believe his minister, why doesn't the Prime Minister stand up and speak for himself? When will he close these stations?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, of course, as a leader... Mr. Speaker, as a leader of the opposition well knows, because he was here, the Prime Minister stood in his place and answered 5 times those questions. The ministers of this House also answer questions. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, without equivocation, that the attacks that are taking place on democracy, be it by Russia, be it by China, by any authoritarian regime, are something that we must stand in unison against, Mr. Speaker. That the attack on one member of this democratic House is an attack on every single one of us. We cannot direct, Mr. Speaker, our security and intelligence, but we can sure stand up for democracy.
John Report.
In an independent manner, and I entered into contact with the member for Wellington Halton Hills to reassure him on this subject.
L'Honorable Shift.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition
reached out to reassure him on the subject. That might have been something to do 2 years ago. 2 years ago. 2 years ago, in July of 2021, the government had a CSIS document showing that an agent for the dictatorship in Beijing was arranging to sanction and punish the family of a Canadian MP because of how he voted on the floor of the House of Commons. And yet for 2 years, this Prime Minister's government kept that agent accredited with diplomatic immunity, allowing him to abuse countless other Canadians of Chinese origin. How can we believe anything he says about protecting our national interests?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's simply not true. It's actually irresponsible to suggest that any government might sit on a matter of such seriousness. Based on briefings that I received following yesterday's story, I know that steps have been taken to protect members when they could be in the spotlight of foreign actors because of the legitimate work they do in this place. And our security agencies will continue to independently do this important work, and I have indeed followed up directly with the member for Halton Hills to reassure him on this.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
You can forgive the member for Halton for not feeling reassured. Nobody should feel reassured. The Prime Minister says my question was false. What was false in it? We know there was a July 2021 document 2 years ago showing that an agent for the dictatorship in Beijing was threatening the family of a Canadian MP because he had stood up for human rights on the floor of this House of Commons. Now, normally that would be a criminal offense for anyone to do, but this individual has immunity granted by this government. Has the Prime Minister taken away that immunity and kicked the diplomat out of Canada? Yes or no?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think outside of this House, where there is extraordinary partisanship and sometimes personal attacks, I think most Canadians understand that no government of any stripe would see a direct threat on a member of this Parliament and their family and sit on it and not ensure anything was acted. That's simply unworthy of anyone sitting in this House to make those kinds of accusations. I can assure the members opposite that we continue to take any threats seriously.
Absolutely.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I have to confess, before 48 hours ago, I would have agreed that no government would ever sit on threats of this nature over 2 years long. But unfortunately, what we've learned is that is exactly what this Prime Minister did. The government knew in July of 2021 that an agent acting for the dictatorship in Beijing, accredited to work at the consulate in Toronto, was threatening a family member of a Canadian parliamentarian, and the Prime Minister's government knew about it and did absolutely nothing. Why?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that is simply not true.
And yet he did absolutely nothing other than to hold a meeting with the MP after the information became public. He wasn't interested in protecting Canadians. He was interested in protecting his political reputation, Mr. Speaker. He has the power to kick this diplomat out. Think of it. If a Canadian had threatened an MP or his family over a vote in the House, that Canadian would be in jail. This individual can't be arrested because of diplomatic immunity granted by this government, something the Prime Minister could take away any time he wants. Why is he keeping this agent in our country threatening our people?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, what the member opposite is proposing is actually not the truth. We are actually continuing to work with our security agencies and ensuring that whenever threats are arisen against Canadians, those security agencies take action, offer briefings, offer support, offer information as necessary and as appropriate every step of the way. That's what our security agencies do to keep Canadians safe, and to suggest that anyone in this House would see a threat to a colleague and simply sit on it is unworthy of parliamentarians.
The Honourable Member for Chambly. Well, I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, that I don't see what is not true in the questions asked by the Leader of the Official Opposition. So I support the questions that has been asked here today so far. So I have a question for the Prime Minister of a country that is looked down on so much by China that they see us as an easy target. If, Mr. Speaker, the administrator of the Trudeau Foundation were to be found to be in error by anyone, would the Prime Minister recuse himself from any element of intervention? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I can reassure the Leader of the Bloc Québécois that here in Canada we have strong institutions which ensure that political interference in our politics or our legal process is not allowed, and legal processes will go forward as necessary. The Honourable Member for Chambly. Well, I'll start again, Mr. Speaker. If one of these legal authorities, whether that be the committee, whether that be the CRA, or anyone else, questioned the possible irregularities committed by the brother of the Prime Minister, would he consider that he should not make decisions concerning a public independent inquiry on Chinese interference? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, despite the efforts that have been underway for a number of weeks now from the Leader of the Bloc Québécois, there's one fact that hasn't changed over the last few weeks or even since 10 years, which is that I have no direct or indirect involvement with the Pierre Trudeau Foundation.
The Honourable Member, l'Honourable Député de Burnaby South.
The Beijing government targeted a member of this House, and targeted not only the member, but the member's family. The Prime Minister knew about this and did nothing. Frankly, I'm disappointed. This goes beyond partisan politics. This is about the ability for people in this House to be able to vote their conscience. Why did the Prime Minister inform the member that his family was being threatened? And what will the Prime Minister commit to doing to make sure this never happens again?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it would be outrageous for anyone in this House to see a direct threat at an individual or their family sitting in this House and do nothing. And that did not happen, Mr. Speaker. I would be absolutely unequivocal about that, and that is why we were pleased to be able to offer a full briefing to the member for Wellington-Halton Hills so he could ask questions of the top intelligence officials and ensure that we will continue as institutions, as a government, as security services to do everything necessary to keep Canadians safe.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Look, honestly, it's clear that this government doesn't care about the damage caused by our inaction, by foreign interference, and it's clear that the Prime Minister should have known that the family of the member had been threatened. So, what will it take for this Prime Minister to act and call a public inquiry right now? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have acted, and we have since 2015, by creating, when we were head of the G7 in 2018, a mechanism to fight interference with our allies. In 2019, we put in place a committee of national security experts to ensure that our elections were fair and had not been interfered in. We created a parliamentary oversight committee, and we created NCIR as well. We continue to do what's necessary. We now have an expert, an independent expert, who is looking at
the Honourable Member for Wellington-Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the government has had 24 hours to get some basic facts about the PRC diplomats' targeting of MPs. So here's my question. On September 10th, 2019, the Public Safety Minister issued a directive to CSIS ordering the service to inform the Minister of any matter or action of interest to the Minister. When was the Public Safety Minister or his office first made aware that a PRC diplomat, Mr. Wei Zhou, was targeting me or my family?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, since this is the first occasion in which the member for Wellington-Halton Hills has raised since this matter was brought to the attention of the public in this chamber, I want to express solidarity to him and to his family, and that we will continue to work with him and all parliamentarians to make sure that he and all parliamentarians get the support that they need. Mr. Speaker, since the outset, when we took the reins of government, we have been vigilant in fighting against foreign interference. We have put in place the people, the resources, the tools, and the oversight, as the Prime Minister just said, to defend our institutions. We will do that work together.
Before we go to the next question, I want to remind honourable members that calling each other names is not parliamentary language. The honourable member for Wellington-Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the directive of September 10th, 2019 is clear. It directs the service. It says that the service has a duty to inform the Minister of any such matter as is relevant to enable the Minister.
John Report.
To fulfill the Minister's accountabilities as outlined in the CSIS Act. In general terms, the Minister expects to be consulted or informed regarding any action on which a deputy head would normally involve his or her minister. So my question again is very simple. When did the Public Safety Minister or his office first become aware that a PRC diplomat was targeting a member of this House and their family?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague across the aisle for highlighting the directives that this government has put in place to ensure transparency and accountability around decisions which are taken independently by our nonpartisan professional public servants when it comes to which classified information is made public and which must remain classified to protect people that work in that space. Mr. Speaker, this is not a partisan issue. We must all work together to defend the institutions, the communities, and most importantly, the parliamentarians who serve those institutions to protect our democracy.
Well, member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, what a gutless response. What if that happened to that minister's family? I have the same question. When did he know?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've just said, it is our nonpartisan, independent public servants who make decisions around operations, including which classified information.
Was not the same donor as the tax receipt. In her testimony, Pascal Fournier stated that the board member in question was Farah Mohammed. In 2016, you were made aware that the real donor was not listed on the tax receipt.
No, I'm sorry. I was listening on Friday, and I thought that that conversation took place not in 2016, but in the past few weeks. I'm not sure.
So were you aware at that time? Were you made aware by Farah Mohammed on the board that it wasn't the same person?
No. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the donation was made by the company that's here registered in Dorval. I had no reason to think it was anybody else.
You sent it to China.
Because that's where Mr. Zhang's address was.
Did you conduct any type of audit, any type of eyes wide open approach to a risk assessment of sending a tax receipt to a foreign company or to a foreign location?
No, because the only company that could use the tax receipt would be the Canadian company to whom it was issued.
In her testimony to the committee, Pascal Fournier stated that the 2016 receipt that was issued by the foundation and signed off by yourself did not include the names of the two donors that were mentioned in the contract and included the address in China. So did the foundation have any policies on those types of discrepancies?
I don't believe it had any policies. Particularly, I think the policy was the tax receipt should be issued to the entity, either an individual or a corporation that makes the donation. And that's what we did.
So what you signed off on, did it include the name of the two donors?
I don't remember. As far as I can tell, we signed off on, there is one tax receipt in the package to Millennium Corporation, the one in Dorval. The name of the donors isn't on there. There was an issue around what the correct address was.
Were the donors board members of the Millennium Gold Eagle?
Mr. Zhang was a board member of Millennium.
Was the other?
No.
So you issued a tax receipt to a corporation that did not include one of the donors?
Because because the corporation was the donor.
Not the two people who made the donation.
The money came from the corporation.
In an annual report in 2016, 2017, the information that was shared with the CRA, the name of the company, Millennium Gold Eagle, was not included, but the name of the donors were.
Yes.
Can you explain the discrepancy between that and what you just said?
I thought I did in my opening remarks by saying that I think that it made sense for the foundation, having met its obligations to the CRA, to have put the name of the two individuals who were the face of the donation and in whose name these conferences would be held.
In any of your board meetings, did any of the board members or any of the senior staff, including legal or financial or otherwise, raise concerns around the discrepancy and the sensitivity of the donations?
I do not recall that they did, and the other thing that I will say is that there were controls in place in the foundation to deal with the issue of receipting on donations. As you'll see from the package, the correspondence was between two more junior employees of the foundation on the receipting, along with a representative of the China Cultural Industry Association who was working for Mr. Zhang, who simply said, could you please send it to this address? So when you say instructions from China, they were about what address to send them to.
Was the address in China the address of the Chinese Cultural Industry Association?
The address that we have, and the only research I've been able to do, is it's the same address, ultimately, as the address given for Mr. Zhang in this Canadian government
Sure, but you didn't, like, I'm sure a Google search or something would probably bring up. I just want you to have the opportunity to put on the record that it wasn't the Chinese Cultural Industry Association, because you would recognize the relationship between the Chinese People's Republic of China and this association, right, as being
Yeah, I would recognize that
proxy?
it's what I would call a soft power organization that was involved in the U of T donation, that was involved in the U of M donation. So two of the biggest universities in Canada.
Last question. You'd mentioned the governance around the board, and I'm trying to determine whether these are significant governance issues that's gotten us here today, or whether there's something more. I think that's where I'm at. Can you just explain to me the nature in which board members are appointed? I'm understanding there's three categories: ISET appointees, Trudeau family appointees, and the members. Is that correct?
Independent appointees, I guess I'd call them.
Not independent of the family. They make direct appointments, do they not?
No, sorry. The members of the board, the members of the foundation, which are the equivalent of shareholders
Sure.
of a for-profit corporation, they have two jobs. One is to choose the auditors, the other is to appoint the board.
All of the board?
No, the independent members of the board, and then you've got because you have three categories of members. You've got
Right.
family members, you've got government members, and you have independent members.
Who has the majority of the seats on the board?
The independents, I believe.
Mr. Green?
Thank you.
That concludes our first round. We are going to go back to Mr. Barrett for 5 minutes. And Mr. Rosenberg, just so you know, typically on this committee, the exchanges happen between the members. I'm not so formal as for it to come through the chair, so any interaction you have is directly with committee members. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett, for 5 minutes.
Did you follow the CCIA instructions on where to send the donation?
I believe that my staff did. I wasn't aware at the time,
Your
I don't
records
believe, of these
indicate that
interactions,
in
and I don't
subsequent
believe
years, your average donation, a total donation was like $25,000. This was an outlier donation. You are an endowment that is not dependent on donations. You took $200,000 and then didn't take the last payment. You would have been the one to make the decision not to take the last payment. Why?
I don't recall at the moment why. I would say this, given all the publicity around the donation in the Globe and Mail, we had to kind of put off the conferences that we were going to have.
Last question. With that scrutiny,
Mr. Green?
did you enact any type of investigation after that?
No, we didn't.
Okay. That's the first round of questioning. We're next going to go to a 5-minute round, second round, and we are going to begin with Mr. Brock. Go ahead, Mr. Brock. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Rosenberg, just want to confirm, we've heard a number of issues. I just want to confirm one point with respect to Alexander Trudeau. Your evidence is, to the best of your recollection, without referring to any of the documentation you had before you, that Alexander Trudeau was only instrumental in negotiating one contract for the Trudeau Foundation, yes or no?
To the best of my recollection, yes.
Thank you. Following up on Mr. Green's last question to you, I'm not satisfied with your response that it was close to my departure. That payment was due July the 1st, correct? Pursuant to the contract?
I'd have to look at the contract, but assuming it was.
First payment 2016, second payment 2017, third payment?
I'd have to look at the contract.
Right.
To see.
Okay. Now, you also interviewed with Vashi Kapelis on CTV Question Period some time ago, and you were quoted as saying that if the situation existed today, in hindsight, looking at it from a 2023 perspective, not a 2016 perspective, you would not have accepted donation. I think there would have been a different decision made for sure. You stand by that statement?
Yeah, as I said.
Thank you. You'd agree with me, being a DM of Foreign Affairs, the very issue of foreign election interference was very much on the radar map in 2016, as it certainly is in 2023.
I would say only after the U.S. election.
I think you also appreciate, sir, that there has been a number of articles, a number of interviews that have been given by a number of entities that have severely questioned your integrity and your character with respect to your handling of this particular donation, and you being instrumental in preparing the report sent to the Prime Minister. Media is asking questions, questioning your integrity and ethics. Canadian politicians are asking the very same question. Canadians are asking that question. Particularly Chinese Canadians are asking that question. And now we find out your former colleagues at the Foundation are asking that question. Now, according to you, from all the evidence that I've heard...
Which former colleagues?
I'm not going to specify that. What I've heard so far from you today is, notwithstanding everything that is going around this situation, you saw no red flags whatsoever with respect to this donation. Correct?
At the time, that is correct. We actually thought there was no pressure put on us, that the money actually came with no strings attached, and that the idea of putting on conferences to do with China was actually very attractive.
Thank you, sir. No strings attached and no direct efforts to influence Justin Trudeau, the new Prime Minister of this country. You didn't see any red flags whatsoever.
I did not.
Right?
That's correct.
In fact, you told Vashi you had no reason to think there was anything untoward about the donation. Donations were putting on conferences. Correct?
Correct.
Notwithstanding that at the time, you also knew that there was a report from the Globe and Mail regarding a leaked CSIS source.
At the time, no.
And the CSIS source intercepted a 2014 conversation between Mr. Zhang and an unnamed commercial attaché at one of China's consulates in Canada. They discussed the federal election that was expected to take place in 2015 and the possibility that the Liberals would defeat Stephen Harper's Conservatives and form the next government. The diplomat told Mr. Zhang that Beijing would reimburse him for the entire amount of the donation to the Trudeau Foundation, according to the source. I am gobsmacked beyond belief to listen to you in the role as President and CEO and a former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to suggest you knew nothing about CSIS intercepting a very important call. You know CSIS reports to the government on any political interference whatsoever. You know that.
Would you like me to answer?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, the first I ever heard of that was in an article that was published in the Globe and Mail on February 28th of 2023.
No one believes you. Canadians don't believe you, sir.
How?
Mr. Chair. Just
sorry.
Again, on a point of order, we're like 3 seconds left here, Mr.